the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome, SJ, to an episode of Within Orb. I'm so excited to have you here, and I want to let everyone listening know that I met you before you were an astrologer.
You did, and just to say thank you for having me. Great to be with you, great to see you, great to connect. And yes, we met before I was an astrologer back in 2016, and I've been on other shows, through the years, and you've come up, I've mentioned this to people, they're like, how did you get into astrology? And I just say, I met Dr. Zahrt, 2016, Tree Fort in Idaho. And you know what it was? I'll tell you this now, that what you shared that caused me to be bit by the astrology bug. You said sometimes people come together in relationships just for a transit. And you mentioned the Jupiter transit, that maybe I think two people sharing the same Jupiter would join together to experience like a Jupiter return. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned that Jupiter is 12 years through the signs. And that's all it took. It just blew my mind because I had just lived through a 12-year cycle. And that explained, it was the missing piece. And then I was off the deep end down the rabbit hole, and I've never come back up. I've just stayed down that rabbit hole. Yeah. No, I've been watching from a distance because I remember meeting you at that house during the festival, and I was surprised all of a sudden. At one point I was on Twitter and I'm like, what? SJ's an astrologer now? What happened? Wait, no. What's going on? So that's been so cool. Most people know you through your Twitter world and on Earth. Where are you located right now? I live in Albania. I live in the Western Balkans here in Albania. So people don't really know much about it, but think Greece, think Italy. It's this style of life, right on the Adriatic. So it's a beautiful Mediterranean. Yeah. How's the food? Food's delicious, very down home, very earthy. A lot of people cook here. There's a cooking culture, and we have all kinds of street food and things. Byrek is one type of food that's common. It's like a pancake with spinach, but yeah, it's really good. That's awesome. That's awesome. I always want to go to Europe and just eat my way through all the countries. So yes, it's a good way to do it. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so let's go back to basics. After we had that conversation that totally got you bit by the bug of astrology that is still pouring its venom into your brain, where did you go to get books? What was it like to get your first astrology books? How did you know what to choose? What was that story like? Yeah, so I had been fortunate because I grew up in Austin, Texas, and I grew up around the University of Texas and I lived around the university my whole life, basically. And so I was very well positioned with library cards, both University of Texas library system and then the Austin Public Library. That was part of my regular work and flow for all of my interests. So I knew that they would have books, and I went there. I had been a regular in the occult section of those libraries, so I knew where to go. But I just this is the truth. I checked out every book. Every book they had. And there wasn't that many because this is an academic library. Well, and that's the reason why I have put all my heart and soul into making CAELi, because I want people to have access to the books you can't find in libraries like that. Yeah. Because they don't stick around long either. Those types of books often walk. They don't get brought back. So the librarians don't go and buy them again. Yeah. So that's amazing. You checked everything out about astrology that you could find. Everything I could find. There was a bunch of stuff in Indian languages. I guess Hindi. I couldn't read those. So I think there was more in those languages actually than in English. But I got everything, probably 20, 30 books total between the two libraries, and maybe 40. And of the ones I checked out, some of them I could quickly see, okay, this is not as well written, or clearly just not clear or something like this. And I was able to read, I read all of them. And the one that stuck out, I was trying to remember some of the titles. They were obscure titles. Real quick, these libraries in the university systems, we're talking the mid-teens when this all happens, or, right, or mid to late teens. They weren't buying books anymore. That culture had shifted where the book buying at those libraries got a lot smaller, I think, after about the year 2000 because of the rise of the internet. So a lot of the titles were old, like 70s, 80s, 90s, or even older. Oh. And that's all you could find. So that was one thing to note. That's another critical flaw. You're right. And even with the Kepler collection, that's kind of the biggest collection of the many that are here at CAELi, they stopped collecting books when they put their books in storage during their teach out in 2012.
Since then, after I got them back out of storage when I was on the board, we still didn't get very many new donations or anything new. So even their books were like stopping at 2012.
Wow.
In the last 10 years, so many amazing things have come out.
Yeah. And I'm happy just selfishly hearing you mention this. We need you. I mean, we need your institute because these books, they do die. It's not even that like the libraries won't order them. They might just, the person that self-published might pass on. Then the book just goes away. Only like 1,000 people ever had the book and then It just dies.
On that note, I found out about a book that Project Hindsight had published about Chinese astrology, but they only printed 50 copies. I think it's called Pillars of Heaven by Ko Hachiguchi.
Wow. And you have the physical pamphlets that they're promulgated? You got your hands on one of those?
I have 5 complete sets of Project Hindsight here. So with it, when people come, you and 4 other people can sit down and enjoy studying all of them simultaneously.
Wow.
Yeah, those ones come back, but there's a lot of interesting, rare things that I don't have yet here. But going back to you, I'm astonished. I mean, I've never heard of anyone say they got into astrology by checking out everything all at once and read 40 things just to get the total lay of the land. That's impressive.
I knew I had to do it because just a quick reason why that all happened. It was a perfect storm it had been building actually for a few years before that. I mean, I was a tarot student and I was a student of occultism and tarot and all of it. When you study tarot, you are getting, a depth charge of astrological symbols. You have to, because that's part of the correspondence systems. But I had this blind spot. I literally was not aware of the field of astrology and how deep it went. I mean, that's just the honest truth. I mean, looking back, of course I was, because movies and things, people you hear about the astrologer character or something, but it just kind of wasn't in my awareness. And that's when I met you. And that weekend, by the way, you were, I think, giving a lecture with one of the colleges. You were like, okay, guys, I've got to take a break Saturday from this hour to this hour to teach. And so I was like, wow, it's an academic component. Then your knowledge, like it became very clear to me there was a huge gap in my knowledge. And since I was already so motivated with my studies, that's why I did it in such a freakish way, because I was thirsty to fill those gaps that I realized I had through our conversations.
That's awesome. And I mean, if it was Jupiter that was the kickoff, you definitely went about it in a Jupiterian way, like all of the books, right? I'm going to expand my mind this much.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. So if you can think of a title, though, that does stand out in that array of 40 books, because I mean, you're like, my first astrology book was 40 books. Is there at least like one that you would pick to say like, no, if I were going to name something that really like spoke louder than the others, which book would it be?
Yeah, it was the Kevin Burk book. And I think it's something like Your Understanding Your Birth Chart by Kevin Burk. That was the book that grabbed me the most.
It's a light blue cover with a nice little sort of armillary sphere looking thing on the front.
Yep, that's a beautiful version of it. It was a hardback, and they had ordered it. It was probably from 2001, I think, is when it was published, or 1999, 2001.
Right.
So I felt like that was one of the last books that these librarians ordered in the astrology field, and maybe that was part of it. I think more than anything that book taught me rulership, some basic first introduction to rulership. And the one thing I remember most about that book that kind of blew my mind was I drew my dispositor tree at the end. You have a technique, a workbook, and I saw my chart. And first of all, I got my chart as soon as I came back, and I had gotten it a long time ago. My grandmother made it for all the family members, but I had no idea even what my moon sign was when we talked in 2016. I learned what my moon sign was, but then now I was seeing the chart and with this whole new way to view it with this tree, and it just sort of blew my mind. And it's funny because that technique is an essential technique for my natal work now. I mean, I have come back to that as sort of primary in terms of not exactly how he does it, but I mean, a lot of what's there is what I utilize in a major way. So that's why I remember that book more than any, is because of that technique and that workbook in the back.
Okay, so tell me more about how you use this dispositor tree.
I mean, it's just rulership, When I look at a chart, I prepare for my client sessions. I will build the domicile tree of dispositors just to understand where the energy flows in the nativity, what houses are maybe where things are flowing, just to get prepared for those conversations, because it's just a way to think about the life. I call it the backstop of the nativity. So, any transit in any house will flow ultimately through the so-called river of, domicile rulership into certain sectors. And if you can feed those sectors and think about the chart from that model and are kind of feeding those sectors, I think it can reverberate back through and sort of support whatever else is happening.
That's a really cool metaphor.
It's just how I see it.
Yeah, yeah. Also, then you used river, but as you were speaking, I thought about the tree shape and then the idea of the tree of life and the Sephiroth and all of that, which comes into play with certain tarot decks as well. And kind of this hidden tree inside the chart.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it can be complex too. I mean, that's the thing when you work with enough of domicile trees. I mean, they're not all clean. They're wildly dispersed, or they're sometimes so pointed on one sector. It's a big way of how I like to see astrology now, Jen, actually, is like, what are different ways to present the data? It's a way to create art, so-called, around the data, because the data is the same. It's the ephemeris. But how you present it can be wildly different.
Right, right. Okay, so now here comes the question I ask them all. If you were going to be stranded on a desert island and you had a copy of the ephemeris, what other 3 books would you take with you?
So, yeah, I wanted 2 from the ancient world, the 2 that I probably read the most and that inspired me the most, Vettius, Valens. And I put book 1, I think even chapter 1, if I wanted to specify, but I think book 1, I don't know, but I put book 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And then I put Ptolemy, and that's the one that I read. I'd say those 2 are my primary. And then I have this is maybe would surprise people, I don't know, but Rudhyar's. Oh, I even forgot the title. I know this is.
I pulled it out from the stack. There's 2 copies here with little different mandalas on the front.
Perfect. I get it confused with Pulse of Life a lot, but yeah.
Yeah. New Mansions for New Men.
Amen.
The fonts on these books are pretty incredible, like little rose-colored.
That's a beautiful book. Yeah, I love the black and yellow. Looks like, is that a 12-pointed flower?
It is, but there's also a nice 6-pointed star in the center.
Beautiful. Okay, yeah. Wow. The occult, esoteric symbolism,
totally.
Full of that in Rudhyar's work. And so, yeah, those are the 3.
I would love to hear more about why you picked Rudhyar and what it is about New Mansions for New Men that you would want to keep as your precious 3rd book on this remote place.
This is the thing about that book is that, and this is how I've increasingly seen my astrology, or what I'm interested in, let's say, as an astrologer, is the symbols that are primary for me, planets and houses. That's mainly what I use when I delineate and when I think about the transiting sky and think about my life. And those symbols, just like we talked about, there's a lot of room for work and creative work for astrologers today. Even with just the symbols that are common to us all and that have been common across the tradition, there's work to be done. Like, we're deepening in the understanding of those living symbols is really the idea. I mean, they're alive. And our work, I think, is to prune them, keep them healthy, you might say. Like, what does Mars mean? Keeping that healthy, especially as culture changes, language changes, ideas change. Even in the last 10 years, like setting aside astrology, new words are invented, new concepts, new ways to think about the self. And so we have to maintain and prune those primary symbols. And then when we read charts, we have the tool set that we're deploying, those living symbols, which are the core to chart reading in my view. So that book is so inspiring to me because that's all he's doing there. He goes through the houses and then he goes through the planets, and he writes the Rudhyar style essays about what those symbols meant to him at that time, and using his theosophical background, using his, Jungian depth work, and then his writing skills. I mean, he's an awesome writer. He's probably my favorite writer, my favorite astrological writer. So that's really why I want to read his prose, is the short answer. But because of the approach to what he's trying to do, I think that's the most important thing, in my view, for all astrologers, and how I think about myself and the work I want to do.
Do you think that his music, his ability to compose music, comes through also in his writing?
Absolutely, because there's the way that themes circle back and the way he kind of sets things up, and there's crescendos of ideas that then kind of settle, and then he'll tease them out. And you hear a classical composition, they stay with that theme, and then it kind of dances and forms in different ways. He can be hard to read too. I think you have to have an appetite or a palate for him. I certainly do. He's one of my favorites. I always am inspired. I'll pick up what he wrote about Mars in that book recently. I was reading that again. I was like, wow, this sounds like Valens, actually. That was my thought. I was like, there's a continuity of he was trying to distill the planets, the meaning of the planets into there's 3 words in one section. And he's like, Mars, I forgot. It's sex and action and force or something. And you go to Valens, and there's a section in book 1, chapter 1, and right at the end of his list of what the planets mean, where he distills the planets into 1 or 2 words. And he's like, Mars is the ruler of action. So Rudhyar's doing that. He's distilling the planets into his own words. That's why I added the book, but that's to go back to this idea of what I think is important. Valens is doing that too. That's why I want to keep his version of that. He says, here's the planets. Let's start. Let's go into them. What do they mean at some kind of root level? And so anyhow, that's just to say that's the Valens-Rudhyar connection.
I think that's beautiful because I also feel like there's this entry point these days for people learning astrology through the traditional methods that were not available to people who only had to start with Rudhyar back in the 70s and 80s or even 60s. And so to have a revival of, our 20th century forebears, I think is really cool in its own way. I mean, maybe I'm saying that after, the Saturn return of Project Hindsight, but you're not the first person to tell me that Rudhyar is making a splash landing in the brain. So that's really neat to see that there's this longevity and returning to some of the beauty of what happened in the 20th century and not just being revolted by it because they didn't have traditional books,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've always felt that way. I mean, I love the traditional stuff. I love the techniques. I love the way we can see a chart and how rulership is an example, how fundamental that is. And I wasn't taught that in any of those 40 books, by the way, until I got to
Burk.
Burk.
Yeah.
And even after reading those 40 and Burk, and it might, that's a rough estimate, but it was a bunch. And I remember still feeling, I don't understand how the signs, the planets and the houses work. I still didn't understand that after reading all of it. And that's why I decided to study with, my primary teacher, Chris Brennan. That was the only reason. I was like, I still don't get this. I see this guy. He seems clear. I'm hoping that if I study this with him, I can have an answer. Okay, how do these basic symbols interact? How can I come to my own, at least, understanding of how they interact so I can use it? And I found the answer, but it was through the traditional methods is how I found that answer.
Yeah.
And so that's how I bridge the two. It's like the traditional architecture, the traditional foundation, but then the reason why I love Rudhyar and a lot of the 20th century people, there's something about the modern meaning outside of astrology, like beautiful artists and thinkers and writers have added layers of what it means to be alive and what it means to be a human being, especially against the backdrop of technological advancement and all of that. And so to exclude all of that from the core symbols, to me, would be a folly. And that's why I like that book, because he's doing that but retaining the core, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And also then you set up this kind of spectrum of continuity, but it's also a spectrum of time, because, from Hellenistic Valens to modern Rudhyar. And yet on this desert island, you would be also still alive and looking up at the sky. You would be able to still have your living relationship with the planets as they walk by you, even though you have books next to you. Another thing you said I think is interesting is that even though your first astrology book was 40 astrology books, it took a relationship with another person, i.e. a teacher, a mentor, somebody individual, to help guide you through all of those things. And I think that's a very important note on, we can love astrology books. I mean, most astrologers I know love books, but it's not the book itself. It's actually what we're doing right here, which is talking about them together. It's the thing that happens after we're done reading it by ourselves, and we can share how we took in Rudhyar or Valens or whatever,
100%. And it's that presentation of what would I say here? Like someone's version of how their astrology, let's just say that. I mean, everybody's got their own astrology. It's like input book, input technique, input through tradition. And then every person will have a different way that they collate, redact, and then present. And that's what it took for me. And then I learned, also got access to ancient texts that I had no awareness of. They were free online, a lot of them, but I didn't find them except through that relationship. And then reading those texts with my teacher and then the other students, that did something. We would present the cohort that I went through with that same year, actually. I mean, it all happened really fast. It just came in. We would meet every weekend. This wasn't part of it. And we would meet as a group and we would pick a nativity. We did Whitney Houston. We did, what were some of the other cool ones? Galileo. There was, Pier Pasolini. That was my favorite. And we would all give a presentation, just applying whatever we wanted, no rules, the techniques we're learning. And that's how I learned that, my insights could be valuable and different than the other students, even though we were reading the same techniques and learning the same techniques. Like what that student grabbed onto, or their passion drew them towards, was different than what mine drew me towards. And so right away, it's like the individual can express their own astrology almost right out of the gate just by following their kind of bliss, to use a Joseph Campbell.
Wow. It's much like that also in literature classes too. You're reading a poem and each student brings in their own perspective on to what the stanzas mean or this or that adjective. So it's cool to hear that that was happening in your astrology group. Was it something the students were doing with you, like you guys had all decided just spontaneously to meet, or was Chris there with you?
He wasn't. I think one time he showed up, but it was a student-led. It was
Awesome.
a student-led, and people like Danny Larkin. I know you know Danny.
Yeah,
he was part of that group, and to some others. But it was just his students that had been bitten by the bug, and we were so excited. That's how we wanted to spend our time. It's like, I want to meet with you on my weekend and talk about Pier Pasolini's chart, and because we were learning things. That's the excitement about this phase of the astrologer's journey. And I don't think it ever ends, really. But that initial phase, when you're bit by the bug and then you're like a sponge and you're taking in the knowledge and the excitement of that phase, you're like, oh, wow, this is like special knowledge that I didn't know. And that it's been a continuous chain of knowledge all the way back. And you learn about, John Dee and different kings. And I mean, you really feel like you're part of something special, and you are.
Yeah. It's like you're gonna pop the hood of the engine of the world and you start to see like, oh my God, for all the astrologers living during the pandemic, we're just going like, okay, Saturn conjunct Pluto, conjunct Jupiter, conjunct the South Node.
Conjunct Mars
right there. I know. And then Mars comes along like, okay, here we stop. And, other people would be like, oh, that's so callous or cynical. And it's like, it's how it works, though.
Yeah.
It's not a cause, obviously, but it's definitely thinking about it, too, in terms of the prior timing in the early 80s. It's like we had a different epidemic at that point.
Oh, yeah. It's not a cause, but it's something. I mean, it's something maybe beyond a cause or a cause, certainly extra than cause, but I don't discount that there's some percentage there. It's too mysterious. It's like a mysterious soup of things.
Yeah.
But it's highly relevant, noteworthy, and profound is how I would see it.
Hello, this is JD Kelley, the host of the AstroMagia Conference, held online this year from November 16th to November 18th. Find out more about the conference at AstroMagia, AstroMagia.org. AstroMagia seeks together creatives, practitioners, and scholars engaged at the intersection of astrology and magic. Some of this year's notable contributors are Chris Warnock, Demetra George, Michael Ofek, Dr. Al Cummins, and Alkissis Dymek. The conference has 7 keynotes, over 40 other talks and presentations, art and performance, aimed at all levels of familiarity with astrological magic, its history and practice. Find out more about the conference at our website and also on this year's theme, Astral Sensibilities and Sensualities.
The presidential prediction. I just came out with my prediction. I made it early this time.
I'm scared. I'm really scared, actually.
I think you'll like it. I'm predicting the Democratic Party wins, whoever the nominee is.
Is that confirmation bias? That's
not confirmation bias. And in fact, the video that I released, I went through a whole thing where I was like, we need to disclose our biases. And I just said, I've never, and I'll just tell you here, it's all public, but I've never voted for either of the 2 mainstream parties. I've always voted third party. It's just my politics. Judge me. People, I'm sure, can judge me for that. But I mean, this is a whole nother conversation of like, when it comes down to the 2, who would you then pick or who would you prefer? And certainly I would not prefer, some kind of militarized right-wing model. But in terms of what votes I would cast or who I support verbally, it's neither of those parties. But I think they're going to win again. I think the Democrats will win again. And I put it on Twitter, and some people were responding like, you are demeaning our politics. Like this is, and I was like, hey, I mean, I'm pretty good at, like, people can attack, and I don't really ever, I try to be constructive when I respond to stuff like that. But I was like, hey, the world of astrology, if you're new to this, like, just wait, because all of 2024, this is what we do every cycle. It's not because we're trying to demean the politics. We're actually getting high off of our own craft because of how cool we think it is. And this profundity thing, or, this cause, whatever it is, like, this is what we do to sort of cut our teeth and celebrate our craft. And, it's by no means would I ever say, like, don't be involved politically. If, it's not an excuse to dismiss that. It's this other thing that I think astrologers understand,
Yeah, I mean, even looking at Elsbeth Ebertin, who was a mundane astrologer in the early 20th century in Germany, she predicted Hitler's rise to power, but she was always advocating in every regime she was a part of. I mean, she was born during the time of the Second Reich, and then the Weimar Republic gripped Germany for a number of years, and then the Third Reich happened. And every single time she just goes, astrology is above all this. I'm an astrologer. That's what I am. And things come and go. Governments come and go. Religions come and go. But astrology is like it, you know? And I think that's a cool perspective. And it also is a privileged one because she doesn't have to deal with being on the negative side of history with certain individuals who are harmed by those governments and those political systems and those religions. And so on the one hand, it's attractive to say that, like, oh yeah, astrology is above all of that. But like you were saying earlier, you know, in your group of people meeting, we all bring our own biases to it, even if we think we're not bringing them because we're culturally situated. And so it just takes an extra effort. Once you're done being in that passionate, like devour it all phase of astrology, then realizing like, oh, right, this was, you know, written during this time. And there's so many books written in the 20th century by women who had to use masculine names or who ghost wrote their husbands' books that don't get credit because at that point, being a woman in the publishing industry was seen as a negative thing. So, I mean, there's all these like layers of political engagement and kind of, you know, what can be said and what's not said. It's attractive to think that astrology is above it all, but it's not exactly that.
Yeah. I say this all the time to my clients and just in my conversations is we have to throw the astrology out sometimes. So I kind of go the other way rather than rising above and like, I'm an astrologer and I'm going to stay here. I prefer the other way where, yes, astrology is central and I want to spend a ton of time there, but I think it's good to actually just cast it all out when we need to and just come to other forms of wisdom and knowledge that would be more appropriate to meet the moment, whatever that moment is. And so certainly in a political moment where those politics are indispensable for a struggle of some kind, I would say go to politics first and then come check in at night, maybe check the moon and see where, you know, to kind of support that. But the other knowledges are more important. And so I'm a big advocate of that for sure. Even though I think about it all the time. You were in the field too. I mean, we don't spend a day it's ever present. I mean, there's nothing.
I don't know. I'm 25 years in at this point, maybe slightly over. And I have developed an ability to turn it off because, you know, like I'll have people who are helping out at CAELi come to me and they'll be like, oh yeah, the moon's in Aquarius, da-di-da-di-da. And I'm kind of like, okay. Not because I don't care, but just because like when you turn it into your full-time profession, at some point you have to like learn how to like tune out. Not think about where the moon is or like what's the aspect of the day and just let it happen and then use it more like a 2020, like you were saying, like live your life and then look into the ephemeris when something happens like, oh, look, there's that.
This whole question to me is like a whole topic that's so fascinating. And would you say you're thinking about astrological ideas or concepts, even though setting aside like ephemeris tracking, because even I don't do that all the time. I may know where it is because I'm publishing about it a lot. So I have to do it for that side of my work. But
right.
I'm not obsessed with my transits or anything, but do you think about it at least some time during the day at some level?
I think about like when people talk and they say things like, ooh, I'm 47 and I just took a new name. I'm like, oh, you're in a 12th house perfection year, honey. That's cute. Or in the news, you know, and I think Sam Reynolds was the one who cued me into this of just like, this was what we were talking about in 2016. It's just Jupiter return news stories where you just see like, oh, this person and this person are 12 years apart in age, but they have this public encounter and everybody learns about it, you know, in that sense. Or, you know, when there's a significant news story, it crosses my mind. But I mean, I'm aware of larger cycles, I think more, you know, I'll think about, I love doing consults with 32-year-olds because it's a major phase return for Mars and Venus around their solar return. So that to me, I'm thinking about those synodic phases a lot, you know, especially like right now when people are all talking about, oh, Venus retrograde in Leo. I'm like, I'm just thinking back 8 years, you know, and sometimes 4 for the superior conjunction and just kind of reflecting on things and thinking about what comes back up, what's, you know, relevant again, what are my dreams telling me kind of thing. But it comes in at that level, you know.
Would you say constantly that's like there with you or because part of why I asked, Jenn, is I'm curious, like I don't foresee a version of myself. And of course, when you talk about this stuff and I'm knocking on wood, because I don't want to ever have a version of myself that isn't kind of tapped into this. What is Rudhyar calls it? He calls it the planetization of consciousness. And I feel like my consciousness has been planetized, you might say. And so playing with the different ways that might be in all these different forms. That's why I'm asking kind of selfishly as someone who's kind of thinking about how this might shift or alter. Certainly like outer planet transits, I'm sure, we know Pluto is in Aquarius. It's going back. Are you thinking about that context?
Well, I'll tell it from a different vantage point.
Okay.
So people born in 1953 have Saturn conjunct Neptune in Libra. And I'm thinking about them because we're about to have Saturn conjunct Neptune in Aries.
Okay.
So I'm looking at them as like a time slice and a resonance, a recurrence transit of what's about to happen and what will become relevant for them as that occurs as a group of people. And I know a lot of them. Some of them are just, very close to me. So it's like then they become prominent in my mind, knowing that that's about to happen. And when we have a recurrence transit like that, it's almost like a key in a lock, making the little bolts go so that the lock opens and then we can fully express ourselves. And it's just a true transmission of what it's like to be me. So I'm looking at that like, oh, I'm going to live through this. And what is it like to be them in that moment, right? What's that going to be like when they have that recurrence transit? Mm-hmm. And, it's at the end of their careers for some, or some might be retired, or a lot of them aren't on the planet anymore. So it's just thinking about those things and like thinking of, I'm not sure who it was, maybe Bashka, maybe someone else, but they said that people are like time slices. And so you have that kind of inaccurate model of the solar system, but the sun is spinning too in the spiral. And I'm kind of like, oh yeah, okay, so you're a time slice and you're a time slice. And so as I'm interfacing with people, I'll also think about if I have like I always have Astro Gold open on my phone. So yeah. I'll just pop it in and someone will say, when's your birthday? And like, I'll just check their Mars or Venus phase just so I can understand like, oh, okay, we're going to get along or it's going to be crunchy between us. And not because I'm expecting it and I'm going to cause it. It's more like I take the temperature and then I know how to respond when something's uncomfortable to me. And I'm like, oh, okay, this person's doing an early phase Mars. Cool. I'm not into that, but there it is. And so instead of being like, why did you do that? It's more like, okay, you're doing your Mars. Good story, So
interesting. Okay.
It's more like that, I guess.
Yeah, I like it.
They don't teach that in a book. I don't think there's ever really been a book about that experience. That would be a good article.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating to me. I'm just thinking as I hear you talk, like, I need to step up my game with the Venus is obviously the 8 years, but kind of some of these cross cycles. Jupiter and Saturn is one I use all the time just for mundane work.
Sure.
But I'm sure they all have their own combinations and own interesting like intervals of recurrence.
I mean, people have asked when I talk about synodic phases of Mars and Venus in the chart, then people will inevitably be, what about Jupiter and Saturn? And I'm like, but they're not really interpersonal planets. I'm sure you could make some natal declaration about it, but I just find it less interesting than like how we go after what we want and how we connect to each other. Like when you get those down, the other stuff doesn't matter as much. But I'm moving into Mercury more now because Adam Summer, our colleague, has kind of ignited some of that in me, thinking about some mercurial synodic declarations that can be added to the mix.
Yeah, I'll have to come back to that. I've been kind of keyed into more Jupiter Saturn, more from like career phase. You have Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, you get the double return of Jupiter and Saturn at like 59. One of our colleagues, and I can't think of her name, wrote a Mountain Astrologer article called The Second Saturn Return, the Second Quest, I think is the article. And so, to me, that's how I've seen it more in natal work. I'm very interested in what you're saying because to come back to the kind of Rudhyar or 21st century, this idea of personality or how someone is, it sounds like there's a lot there that you felt into around Venus and Mars in terms of this kind of relation and the relational planets. So it makes total sense. So yeah. I've got some more homework from you now as we've talked again. I've been bitten by a different subspecies of the bug.
Okay, so I'll assign some books for you. You need to get Holographic Transits by Robert Blaschke, but it's out of print because he self-published and he's no longer with us. It's here at CAELi, though. So we need to fly you over and you can come visit. That would be the first place to begin. And then also Adam Gainsbourg in The Light of Venus talks a lot about the Venus synodic cycle and how that moves. But he gives it 13 phases. And I'm like, I'm going to take it the Texan way. I'm like, give me 2. I want the early and the late. The morning star and the evening star. I'm not going to mess with all of that intricacy. He may do that. I think it's wonderful. I don't have that installed in my software,
Cool. I'll look for that Blaschke book. I know he was I've heard his name so much and important astrologer for a lot of people. So I haven't gotten time to delve into him and his work, but this will provide an impetus for that. So
sure.
That's awesome.
Homework for everyone.
Did you want to talk about the last book at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so going back to that initial crush phase of getting to learn astrology, what book would you send to a beginner if you were going to say, okay, you're getting into astrology, you need to read this?
So I have a video I did on this because I wanted to answer the question, and Burk's book is on it. So I would include that book because it just lays out some of the basic concepts. The Dykes book, there's two of them, but the red cover one, it's like an introduction to traditional astrology.
So traditional astrology for today, an introduction. It's very thin.
That's it.
You could totally hide this in your laptop case.
Yep.
If people still have those.
And then Demetra George's book, it's got a blue cover, The Astrology and the Authentic Self. That's it. And this one's amazing because she delineates a chart through the introduction of the techniques she uses. She walks through a person's life that she's intimate with. And so you really see like a more personal application. Most books don't have that. Mm-hmm. And that's like the premise of this text. She's like, all right, and every chapter I'm going to write a whole section at the end about Dan. And I forgot the name. And we're going to break down Dan's chart and how these techniques have worked in his life.
Very cool. Well, yeah, those are all great places to start, especially also I think is less intimidating when you're getting into traditional if there's a very thin book like Ben Dykes' introduction. Because if you tried to pick up Chris Brennan's book or even his version of Valens, you're going to have to build a fort, It's huge.
And that one reads like a dictionary, which I love. You open it up and you can just search the concept. And then he's very footnote heavy. So he's very, explanatory with where he's getting things from. So I feel like that's a great book for anyone who's like a self-learner or wants to have a reference book. It's a great reference book for core concepts of traditional astrology.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, anything else you'd like to share with us before we sign off for the day?
Just to wish everybody well and just love yourself. One thing I'll just say is give yourself permission to, go places that maybe haven't been visited before. I know I said that earlier, but I really want to just underscore that. I think that's what we're all here to do. I tell people that are like new astrologers that I talk to, I'm like, your astrology is important and it's different than everybody else's. Like, it's okay I feel like sometimes people need permission, but bring forth your astrology. You don't need to have this teacher approve you or this teacher approve you or this text approve you. Maybe that's my Mercury in Pisces, which it probably is some of that. I'm sure other people would say, no, that's the wrong advice for young astrologers, but that's the advice I'm going to give you. Unleash your never before seen astrology without permission.
I love that. And you're calling in their birthright. Another really important thing to do for everyone is to ground them in that celestial birthright. So thank you for putting it in those words.
Glad to be here. Thank you. And appreciate everything we've gotten to talk about, Jen. It's just an honor to be with you. A real circle completion moment for me. And, 2016 to 2023, it's just beautiful to be alive. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. See you soon.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye. Peace.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.